Is Russian industry collapsing? The most accurate answer is not all of it, and not all at once. If we looked only at Russia's headline industrial production figures, we might even conclude that the country is still holding up reasonably well. During the first half of 2026, total industrial output reportedly increased by approximately 0.4% compared with the same period 1 year earlier. That is an extremely weak result, but it is still technically growth. The problem is that this national average combines two increasingly different economies. The first is the economy supported by the war. Weapons, ammunition, military vehicles, defense electronics, uniforms, and other supplies purchased directly or indirectly by the Russian state. In this part of the economy, the government is the principal customer. It determines priorities, guarantees orders, and continues to inject enormous amounts of public money. The second is the civilian economy. Cars, commercial trucks, cement, housing construction, timber, coal, diamonds, steel, and freight transportation. And this is where the signs of distress have become increasingly difficult to ignore. The real question, therefore, is not simply whether Russian GDP rises or falls by a few tenths of a percentage point. The real question is this: how long can an economy function when the state continues to sustain war-related production, while large parts of civilian industry face weak demand, expensive credit, shrinking export markets, and increasingly aggressive Chinese competition? Let us begin with the most recent macroeconomic indicators. In July 2026, the Bank of Russia reduced its key interest rate to 14%. That was a reduction from the exceptionally high levels reached previously, but 14% is still an extremely restrictive interest rate, and that is only the central bank's rate. Commercial banks normally apply an additional margin when lending to companies. For a Russian business, financing a new production line, purchasing machinery, expanding a warehouse, or simply borrowing money to cover short-term expenses can still be prohibitively expensive. Official inflation stood at approximately 6% in June 2026. The Bank of Russia now expects inflation to remain between 6 and 7% for the year as a whole. At the same time, economic growth is disappearing. The Russian government lowered its 2026 growth forecast to approximately 0.4%. The central bank now expects GDP growth somewhere between 0 and 1%, while its survey of professional analysts produced a median estimate of roughly 0.6%. In simple terms, Russia may not yet be experiencing a broad statistical recession, but it is dangerously close to stagnation. And this stagnation is accompanied by inflation that remains above the official 4% target and by interest rates that continue to restrict investment and consumption. This combination resembles stagflation, an economy that is barely growing while prices continue to rise. Russia's macroeconomic numbers do not describe an economy in immediate free fall, but neither do they describe a healthy economy. They describe a system with very little room for error. One of the most revealing signs of industrial weakness appeared in 2025, when several large Russian companies introduced reduced working weeks. This was not the kind of 4-day week sometimes discussed in Western countries as a way to improve productivity and work-life balance. In Russia, the measure was primarily designed to reduce labor costs, without immediately announcing mass redundancies. The mechanism is relatively simple. When a company cannot sell enough products, it has three main options. It can continue producing and accumulate unsold inventory. It can dismiss part of its workforce, or it can reduce working hours, working days, and employee compensation. Several large Russian companies chose the third option. A 4-day week allows an employer to reduce production and payroll expenses without immediately adding thousands of people to the official unemployment figures. This helps explain an apparent contradiction. Russia can continue reporting exceptionally low unemployment, while some companies are already reducing the amount of work actually performed. Having a formal employment contract does not necessarily mean working the same hours or earning the same income as before. Official unemployment figures identify people who have completely lost their jobs. They are much less effective at measuring workers who remain formally employed but lose working days, bonuses, overtime, or part of their wages. This is a form of hidden labor market weakness. The job remains, but the income falls. And if weak demand continues, shorter working weeks may become the first stage of a process that eventually leads to factory closures and permanent redundancies. The automotive industry was one of the first sectors to expose the scale of the problem. In 2025, Avtovaz, the manufacturer of Lada cars, introduced a 4-day working week for several months. The decision was linked to weak sales, expensive credit, and the accumulation of unsold vehicles. Avtovaz later announced that it would restore a full 5-day working week in January 2026. It would therefore be misleading to present the old 4-day week as proof that the company remains in exactly the same position today. However, the economic conditions that produced the decision have not completely disappeared. When interest rates are extremely high, purchasing a new car with a loan becomes unaffordable for many households. Leasing also becomes more expensive for companies. At the same time, vehicle prices have increased because of inflation, supply chain complications, and the additional cost of obtaining components that were once imported more easily from Western countries. Russia's car industry is also facing intense competition from China. After many Western manufacturers withdrew or reduced their presence in Russia, Chinese companies rapidly expanded their share of the Russian market. This provided Russian consumers with alternative products, but it also created enormous pressure on domestic manufacturers. The truck market has been hit even harder. KAMAZ, Russia's largest producer of heavy trucks, announced a shorter working week in 2025 after demand for trucks weighing more than 14 tons reportedly fell by around 60% during the first half of the year. This was blamed on high interest rates, limited access to leasing and credit, declining industrial demand, and a large stock of unsold vehicles. The civilian truck market is a particularly useful leading indicator. A company purchases new trucks when it expects to transport more products in the future. When it anticipates fewer orders, it postpones purchases and keeps its existing vehicles on the road for longer. The decline in truck sales, therefore, tells us more than simply what is happening at KAMAZ. It tells us what Russian businesses expect to happen throughout the wider economy. High interest rates produce less credit. Less credit produces fewer purchases. Fewer purchases create unsold inventory. And unsold inventory forces manufacturers to reduce production. Another important warning has come from Russian railways. The state-owned railway system employs approximately 700,000 people, making it one of the largest employers in the country. In 2025, according to information collected by Reuters, employees in the central offices were asked to take 3 unpaid days off each month. There were later reports of plans to reduce management positions, freeze recruitment, and eliminate vacancies. Why are the railways so important? Because Russia is an enormous country in which coal, metals, timber, petroleum products, construction materials, and industrial machinery must travel extraordinary distances. When freight volumes decline, it usually means that something else has already slowed down. Less coal may be leaving the mines, fewer metals may be moving towards export terminals, factories may be ordering fewer raw materials, construction companies may be purchasing less cement. Ports may be receiving fewer shipments. The freight railway is not merely a transportation system, it is an industrial electrocardiogram. When freight activity declines, it can reveal weakness across several parts of the economy at the same time. Russian Railways is also affected by its own costs, investment requirements, and the challenge of maintaining an enormous network. But declining freight volumes are particularly important because they connect the difficulties of mining, manufacturing, construction, and exports. Less freight means less industrial activity, and if railway revenues continue to weaken, the consequences could spread to hundreds of thousands of employees, contractors, and communities. Coal mining and metallurgy are among Russia's most vulnerable industrial sectors. Meckel, one of the country's major mining, steel and logistics groups, has reduced or suspended some loss-making operations. The pressure does not come from a single source. Russia's coal and steel producers face several interconnected problems: lower international prices, the loss or restriction of Western markets, weaker domestic demand, high transportation costs, heavy corporate debt, and extremely expensive credit. Sanctions do not normally operate like an electrical switch that suddenly turns off a factory. Their effects are usually more gradual. A Russian company may still find a foreign buyer, but that buyer may demand a substantial discount. The company may still ship its products, but the route may be longer and more expensive. It may still receive payment, but the financial transaction may require additional intermediaries. It may still obtain equipment and components, but at a higher price and with longer delivery times. Every additional complication reduces profit margins. A company that was already only marginally profitable can begin generating losses when these costs are combined with weak demand and high interest rates. This does not mean that Russia has stopped producing coal or steel. It means that an increasing share of production may become economically difficult to sustain without government support, debt restructuring, discounts, or selective shutdowns. The problem can be summarized in 3 short sentences: higher costs, fewer markets, more debt. Alrosa, Russia's diamond giant, has also come under pressure. The company is one of the world's largest producers of rough diamonds and plays an important role in the economies of several Russian regions. But size does not provide complete protection from sanctions, weak global prices, and changing consumer preferences. In 2025, Alrosa reduced some non-mining personnel and suspended activity at less profitable operations. Sanctions are particularly significant in the diamond industry because the market depends heavily on the traceability of stones and access to major international trading and processing centers. But sanctions are not the only problem. The global natural diamond market is also facing structural competition from laboratory-grown diamonds. These stones are increasingly accepted by consumers, generally cost less, and can place downward pressure on the prices of some natural diamonds. Alrosa therefore faces a combination of geopolitical and commercial pressures. This is an important example because it shows how sanctions can intensify problems that might have existed even without the war. A global producer can continue operating while becoming progressively less profitable. The mine may remain open, the workers may remain employed, the diamonds may still be extracted, but the company's margins become increasingly fragile. The case of Chemros may provide the clearest illustration of the contradictions inside Russia's civilian economy. Chemros is Russia's largest cement producer. In 2025, the company temporarily introduced a 4-day working week to avoid redundancies during a period of declining construction activity and increasing cement imports. Where were these imports coming from? Some arrive from countries regarded as friendly or politically close to Russia, including China, Iran, and Belarus. This creates a paradox. Western sanctions encourage Moscow to redirect trade towards friendly countries. But friendly countries are not charities. They export their own products, expand their market share, and compete with Russian manufacturers whenever they have the opportunity. For Russian construction companies, cheaper imported cement can be beneficial. For a Russian cement producer, the same imported product is a serious problem. If Moscow introduces tariffs or restricts imports to protect Chemros, construction becomes more expensive. If it allows cheaper cement to enter the market, Russian factories lose orders and profitability. Someone must absorb the cost. This demonstrates why replacing Western trade with Chinese or Iranian trade does not automatically create economic independence. It may simply create a different form of dependence. Russia gains access to alternative suppliers, but those suppliers may eventually become powerful competitors. Friends are competitors too. The original material referred to a company called Seveso, but the actual company appears to be Segeza Group, one of Russia's major timber, paper and plywood producers. The timber industry has also been affected by the loss of traditional export markets, weaker construction activity, and higher production costs. But the most important issue is not the closure of one individual mill. It is the way weakness spreads through the production chain. When fewer homes are built, less cement is required. When construction declines, companies purchase less timber and plywood. When fewer materials need to be delivered, demand for trucks falls. When factories receive fewer orders, railway freight volumes decline. When businesses become uncertain about future demand, they postpone the purchase of new machinery. A slowdown in one sector becomes a decline in orders for another. Economists often discuss the multiplier effect when an initial increase in spending generates additional economic activity. The same mechanism can operate in reverse. A reduction in construction affects cement. The cement slowdown affects freight. Lower freight affects railways and trucks. Lower sales reduce wages and investment. Lower investment then weakens future productivity. This is the multiplier effect, in reverse. At this point, we must address the most politically sensitive question. Do these problems prove that Western sanctions are working? The accurate answer is yes, to some extent, but not by themselves and not in the simplistic way often described. Sanctions have contributed to the loss or restriction of export markets, difficulties obtaining components and technology, higher financial and logistical costs, larger discounts on Russian exports, greater commercial dependence on China, and lower profitability in several civilian industries. But Russia's industrial weakness also has important domestic causes. High interest rates imposed to control inflation, the diversion of public expenditure towards the war, a severe shortage of workers, wage increases that exceed productivity growth, weak civilian demand, competition from Chinese imports, delayed investment, and long-standing productivity problems. Sanctions did not create the immediate economic collapse predicted by some commentators in 2022. Russia adapted. It found alternative markets, built new financial channels, increased domestic production, and received support from countries willing to continue trading with it. But adaptation is not free. Every alternative route, discount, intermediary, domestic substitute, and emergency intervention has a cost. Sanctions have not necessarily stopped the Russian economy. They have made it more expensive, less efficient, more militarized, and more dependent on the state. That conclusion may be less dramatic than saying Russia will collapse tomorrow, but economically it is much more serious. Some people may object that if Russian military factories are producing more, there is no reason to talk about an industrial crisis. But not all production has the same long-term economic value. A modern machine can improve a factory's productivity for many years. A new railway can reduce transportation costs across the economy. A modern warehouse can make distribution faster and more efficient. A home provides a durable asset. A missile is produced to be used, destroyed, or stored. A tank destroyed on the battlefield does not improve future productivity. An artillery shell disappears when it is fired. Military production enters GDP because it creates wages, purchases, and industrial activity, but it does not generate the same long-term economic return as productive civilian investment. War expenditure can therefore support GDP in the short term while simultaneously weakening the foundations of long-term growth. The numbers may initially appear similar. $1 billion spent on modern industrial machinery contributes to economic activity. $1 billion spent on missiles also contributes to economic activity. But the result is different. The machinery may continue producing valuable goods for another 20 years. The missile is consumed. This is the central danger for Russia. The country can have factories operating at full capacity without necessarily building a stronger future economy. Production does not always build the future. The next phase is the one that deserves the greatest attention. As long as companies use shorter working weeks, the social damage remains partially hidden. But if demand does not recover, a dangerous sequence can develop. First, companies reduce production. Second, workers lose hours, bonuses, and income. Third, households reduce consumption. Fourth, local shops and service businesses lose revenue. Fifth, other companies reduce investment and employment. Sixth, defaults and corporate debt restructurings increase. At that point, the government may be forced to intervene with subsidies, preferential loans, debt guarantees, or direct support. This places additional pressure on the federal budget. The effect can be particularly severe in towns that depend on a single mine, factory, or railway facility. A reduction in employment in Moscow may be absorbed by other sectors. But in a town built around one steel mill, coal mine, or vehicle plant, the dominant employer supports almost the entire local economy. Its workers purchase goods from local shops. Its taxes help finance public services. Its contracts support smaller businesses. Its salaries sustain housing demand. When the main industrial employer reduces activity, the whole community can begin to contract. An industrial crisis becomes a local crisis. The Russian economy has not suddenly disappeared. Not every factory is closing. Avtovaz, for example, restored its 5-day working week in January 2026. Russia's Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index also rose to 50.7 in July 2026, suggesting a modest expansion in business activity during that month. These facts matter. Ignoring them would turn economic analysis into propaganda. But they do not eliminate the structural problem. Russian GDP growth is now close to zero. Credit remains extremely expensive. Inflation is still above the central bank's target. Several civilian industries have experienced reduced working hours, production cuts, suspensions, or restructuring. Export markets are more difficult to access, and Chinese companies are increasingly replacing Western suppliers while also competing with Russian manufacturers. Russia is therefore not simply an economy that is growing or an economy that is collapsing. It is an economy that is becoming increasingly distorted. The state concentrates money, workers, and productive capacity in sectors considered essential to the war. Civilian industry must compete for expensive credit, increasingly scarce labor, and insufficient demand. The most important question is not whether Moscow can continue producing weapons. It can. The real question is how long it can continue doing so without consuming the industrial, technological, and financial foundations required for life after the war. The most disturbing signal may not be a factory that closes completely. It may be a factory that remains formally open, but produces less, invests less, and no longer knows who will buy its products. Russia's war economy can sustain activity in the present, but it may be doing so by consuming the country's economic future. Thank you for watching. If you found this analysis useful, please like the video, subscribe to Power and Politics, and turn on notifications so you do not miss our next report. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I will see you soon with a new analysis. Until then, stay informed and always look beyond the headlines.